Chapter 5 of Betty Baird by Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 5. Her Unexpected Welcome. At the entrance of the dining room, Betty halted, spellbound. The great size and beauty of the room, which in her eyes, accustomed only to the soft light of oil, seemed magically illuminated by the artistic clusters of electric lights, the dark wood paneling reaching nearly to the ceiling, the rich, heavy mahogany furniture, the great fireplace with high, dignified mantelpiece, the prevalent brilliancy of silver and cut glass, and polished brass against the dark background. All these dazzled and bewildered her. Forgetful of Miss Payne's instructions to ask for Miss Green's table, she stood there in the middle of the high, broad doorway, a slight, old-fashioned figure that seemed to have strayed out of an old picture, her hands clenched behind her, her face framed by the mop of tumbled yellow hair, white and quivering, and her great, luminous eyes looking around helplessly and appealingly. Immovable she stood there until one of the teachers saw her and sent a servant to show her to her place. Then, alone, she walked the length of the room. At her table she found 7 girls and a teacher whom she supposed to be Miss Green. 14 curious eyes saw the new girl take her place with eagerness and evident delight. They saw a girl of 14, small for her age, dressed in a black silk dress with a simulated vest that gave her the appearance of a child masquerading in her mother's clothes. Her bright, sensitive face was flushed, her dark eyes glowing with suppressed excitement, her delicate nostrils quivering. On her left sat a faultlessly dressed girl of her own age, with a cold pink and white complexion, clear blue eyes, light brown hair, a clean, high-bred face without a trace of good feeling. Betty had always made conversation, being the leader of the home set. So, to facilitate acquaintance, she turned to the girl on her left and asked brightly, "How many pupils are there here?" The girl turned and gave her a cold, distant stare. 80, she said after a pause, in an utterly colorless and impersonal manner. Why should the new girl address her, it evidently meant. Betty felt the attitude, though she could not understand it. It was her first snub. Some girls cannot talk, and they have that stiff way. Edith is not much of a conversationalist, she commented to herself. She turned to a calm, pale-faced girl on her right and noticed that she too had a cold, distant look, and she did not feel encouraged to go on. What nice hair all the girls had! They all did it up the same way, with a big puff over the forehead. She thought of her own unruly mop and wished hers looked like theirs. Her natural manner won the admiration of Miss Green, and Betty, after several helpless looks around the table and frightened away by that look which they all seemed to have, turned to her. "Did you have a pleasant journey?" Miss Green asked. "Oh, yes, a delightful one," she answered with ready enthusiasm, though in a voice which she hardly recognized as her own. "I should have thought you would have found it quite warm, traveling in the heat of the day," suggested Miss Green. "I did not mind the traveling, but I did find it warm work to unpack," she replied. "That is very wearing," agreed Miss Green. During this brief dialogue, the other girls stared so unabashedly at Betty that Miss Green, seeing her blushes, stopped out of sympathy. When dinner was finished, Betty hurried to her room to hide her fast-flowing tears, and throwing herself on the bed, cried as if her poor little loving heart would break. "How can girls be so stiff and cold and hard?" she said half aloud in grieved surprise. "The Weston girls were never that way. Perhaps that is the trouble. I am a stranger and do not understand their ways, and they are waiting to see what I'm like. It may not have been dislike that made them stare at me in such an unfriendly manner. Maybe they only want to know more about me before they become friendly. I believe that is it. Tomorrow they will be different." They will see that I am not stupid or mean, and they will soon be friendly." She sat up and began to prepare for bed in a more hopeful frame of mind. That night she slept the sleep of exhaustion and did not wake until the rising bell rang. The next morning she put on her black and white shepherd's plaid dress, which by a happy chance suited her and was the right length. She ate her breakfast in silence, making no attempt to open a conversation, though hoping that some of the girls would prove friendly and talk with her. The teacher had introduced the girl on her left, whose direct cold stare made her warm all over, as Caroline Wren, the pale-faced one on her right as Helen Dyke. Just beyond her was Miriam Kendall. Miriam was small, with a red-lipped mouth that pouted continually, while her slightly tilted nose and the dark arched brows gave some piquancy to an otherwise commonplace face. She did not possess that look to the same degree, so Betty turned to her rather hopefully. All the girls had high, assured voices. Miriam was older than Betty, and tossed her hair with the back of her hand, and pulled down her belt quite like a young lady. Caroline and Helen, as if determined to impress on Betty that she was an intruder, carried on a conversation without the slightest recognition of her presence between them. Never was there more perfect ignoring of a disagreeable object, and only the heat of her reddening face kept Betty from feeling as transparent as a ghost. "Do you know your Virgil?" asked Caroline, as they waited for some of the girls to finish their breakfast. "Not a line," responded Helen indifferently. Miss Greene, seeing their impertinence, addressed Betty pleasantly. "Have you studied Latin, Miss Baird?" Betty gave her a grateful glance as she replied, with something of the old proud spirit, the spirit of the girl who has always been at the head of things. "Yes, Miss Greene, I studied with my father. I have read through 4 books of Virgil." Every girl at the table turned cool, unbelieving eyes at her. Then, each with her neighbor, they began to discuss her statement in an undertone, and with occasional glances which plainly indicated complete disbelief in the truth of it. "She says she has read 4 books of Virgil," said Caroline, as if announcing a peculiarity of a new species. "I don't believe it," answered Miriam in an undertone, as the signal was given to leave the table. Betty had only time to say emphatically, "You must take that back." Miriam pushed by scornfully. "Evidently they don't teach manners here," continued Betty indignantly, while Miriam, with her arm linked in Caroline's, swept on, saying, so that Betty could hear her, "She's a firebrand. You can tell where she came from by those outlandish dresses of hers." Caroline tittered. "Yes, and that hair looks as if it had never been combed." "How red she grew when she flared up at me," said Miriam. "Fair people can't afford to redden so," and her own dark face was very complacent. "Who is she?" inquired Caroline. "Oh, a poor Presbyterian preacher's daughter, a sort of charity pupil, I think." "What a pity we must have her at our table, where everyone is so nice," regretted Caroline. "Dorothy King won't like it," said Helen Dyke, who walked ahead. "She certainly won't," replied Miriam sharply. "She can't bear country gawks." Betty, who was compelled to walk close to them in the regular march from the room, heard every word of this conversation. It not only enlightened her as to the meaning of that look, but it was so utterly unexpected that she did not once think of replying. Tears ran down her hot cheeks as she sat by her window. So far as she could tell, all the girls were alike, and all hated her. She could not comfort herself with the thought that every bright girl at school has a jealous enemy, for these disliked her because she was not their kind. She was an intruder and had invaded their table. She had herself enough schoolgirl clannishness to know what that means, for she had more than once made eyes secretly at Edith when some undesirable girl tried to share their walk home from school. She had been too unhappy to eat much breakfast, and now, feeling hungry, she thought of the chocolates Edith had given her. Tears flowed faster as she remembered how she had put them away for her new friends, and she could hardly bite them for sobs. The poor lonely child sat there for a long time, weeping and munching her candy. Suddenly she sat upright. One thing must be attended to at once. That Kendall girl must take back her insulting words. How could she make her do it, though, when she would not even look at her? Her favorite reading of the old fighting days suggested a way. She could send her a challenge. She wiped her eyes, hurried to her writing desk, and quickly wrote in her large upright hand, "Miss Baird feels grievously insulted by Miss Kendall's spiteful observations on the reading of Virgil at the breakfast table, and demands redress in the form of an apology before the same company. If refused, she hereby challenges said Miriam Kendall to a competitive reading of Virgil." This made her feel much brighter. Barely had she finished when she received a message from Miss Payne to come to her room. End of chapter 5. Recording by Holly Jensen.